I still remember the sound of the fork hitting the plate, that tiny metallic note that cut through the conversation like a crack in glass. My father's hand froze mid-air, a piece of steak halfway to his mouth. Across the table, my mother blinked slowly, once, twice, as if the light in the room had shifted and she wasn't sure why. My sister looked down, pretending to straighten her napkin. No one said a word. All I'd done was tell them I wanted to be a teacher. It wasn't even a declaration, just a quiet sentence that slipped out of me between courses. But in our house, words were currency, and I'd just bankrupted myself. The dining room was a museum of restraint, crystal glasses, silver cutlery, portraits of dead men staring down from the walls. My father sat at the head of the table, as always, a man who believed that control and respect were the same thing. He looked at me for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "A teacher," he said. "You mean at a school?" "Yes," he nodded, as if confirming the existence of a foreign country. "You went to university for economics. You were supposed to join the firm." "I know," I said, "but that's not what I want." The silence thickened. The air felt heavy, like it was being rationed. My father placed his fork down with surgical precision. "Do you have any idea what that sounds like?" "I do," I said. "It sounds honest." The corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, not anger, just disbelief trying to disguise itself as patience. "Honesty," he repeated. "You think honesty pays bills? Builds homes? Keeps names alive?" My sister glanced at me, eyes full of warning. She'd learned long ago that you don't challenge a man who mistakes volume for truth. My mother tried to intervene. "Maybe he just means he wants to teach for a while," she said softly, like someone defusing a bomb. But my father wasn't hearing her. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You grew up surrounded by opportunity," he said. "Everything you have, everything you are, came from discipline, from ambition, from me. And now you want to waste that to..." He stopped mid-sentence, searching for the word. "To inspire children?" He said it like an insult. I didn't look away. "Yes." He laughed then, one sharp breath through his nose, the kind of laugh that ends conversations, not starts them. "You think the world respects teachers?" he said. "They're underpaid, overworked, ignored. That's what you want? To be ordinary?" That word, ordinary, landed harder than any slap. My mother reached for his arm, but he pulled it back. "You're my son," he said. "You don't get to be ordinary." The table stayed silent. After that, even the servants moved slower, as if afraid the air itself might shatter. I sat there, pretending to eat, feeling the walls of the house close in around me. Every portrait, every object seemed to whisper the same thing: "You belong to him." But something inside me had already started, breaking loose. I wanted to tell him that I didn't care about money, that I didn't want to inherit a company built on fear and exhaustion, that I was tired of being shaped by his version of success, where happiness was weakness and kindness was waste. But I knew how that would end, with silence, always silence. So instead, I swallowed my anger and finished my meal. After dinner, I went out to the balcony. The city stretched below, cold, endless, glittering, a skyline of promises that meant nothing to me. Behind me, I could still hear the muffled voices of my parents, my mother pleading softly, my father saying something about family reputation. It was strange. Standing there, I realized I wasn't sad. I was calm, terrifyingly calm, because for the first time, I knew exactly what I wanted. A life that didn't need to be impressive to be meaningful. My father came out a few minutes, later. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, looking at the same skyline he'd conquered decades ago. He didn't look at me when he spoke. "You can do whatever you want," he said, "but don't expect me to respect it." "I'm not asking for respect," I said, "just distance." He turned then, finally, meeting my eyes. "Distance is a luxury, son. You only get that when you've earned it." He walked away. I stayed. The wind was cold, carrying the faint hum of the city below. Cars, laughter, lives being lived without permission. For the first time, I wanted to be part of that noise. That night, I packed a small bag, not to leave, not yet, but because I knew I would. Eventually, you can only sit at someone else's table for so long before realizing the food was never meant to feed you. We're close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Share these stories, not for sympathy, but for the quiet rebellion they carry. And tell me, where are you listening from? Because sometimes, the hardest thing isn't to leave a place, it's to stop asking for a seat at a table that was never yours. Even now, years later, I can still hear that sound, the fork against the plate, The pause that followed wasn't just silence, it was inheritance refusing to die. The first thing you learn in a house like ours is that curiosity is dangerous. It's tolerated when you're a child, encouraged even. He's bright, just like his father. But once you start asking questions that don't have financial answers, the praise turns into silence. My father used to call them useful questions. Ask what will make you richer, he said once, not what will make you feel better. Feelings don't scale. That was the kind of wisdom he gave us. Sharp, polished, perfectly hollow. When I was 10, I remember watching him at his office, the glass tower that bore our last name. He moved through the place like a king among accountants. Everyone stood when he entered, their voices lowering, their smiles tightening. It was reverence mixed with fear, the kind of respect money buys and then demands back with interest. He took me there often, calling it education. I'd sit in a chair too big for me, watching him negotiate deals worth more than most people's lifetime. He'd hang up the phone, lean back and say, "That's how you win. You make people believe they need you more than you need them." At the time, I thought it was genius. Now I see it for what it was. Loneliness dressed as authority. My mother, quieter and gentler, tried to balance him. She'd slip books into my backpack, novels, philosophy, even poetry. I'd read them late at night with a flashlight, the words whispering something didn't yet understand. There are other ways to live. One night, my father caught me reading under the covers. "What's that?" he asked. "Camus," I said. He frowned. "Does he run a company?" "No." "Then put it away." The next morning, the book was gone. That was how he parented, not with cruelty, but with correction. Every curiosity had a cost. Every deviation needed discipline. So when I told him, years later, that I wanted to be a teacher, he didn't hear ambition. He heard failure. I think about that dinner often, about how quickly silence can feel like exile. The truth is, the dream didn't come from rebellion. It came from a memory. When I was 15, one of my teachers, Mr. Ellis, caught me sleeping in class. I was exhausted from another night of pretending to study economics for my father. Instead of scolding me, he asked, "Do you know what you want to do with your life?" I told him, honestly, no. He smiled. That's a good start. No one had ever told me that not knowing was allowed. He lent me a book, Letters to a Young Poet. I read it in one night. The next day, I handed it back, and he said, "Keep it. You'll need it more than I do." That was the first time I felt seen. Not for what I could become, but for who I already was. Years later, when I told my family I wanted to teach, it was because I wanted to do for someone what he'd done for me, to make them feel visible. I didn't want to build empire. I wanted to build understanding. But to my father, understanding was weakness. After that dinner, he stopped speaking to me for a while. Not officially. There was no announcement, no fight, just absence. He'd talk around me, not to me. At breakfast, he'd discuss business with my sister, ignoring me entirely. When we passed each other in the hallway, he'd nod, politely, like I was a guest, overstaying my welcome. Once, I overheard him on the phone with a friend. He wants to be a teacher. A teacher. Imagine wasting potential like, he said potential the way some people say disease. I remember sitting in my room that night, looking at my degree. The one he'd forced me to earn. The paper looked expensive. The words felt empty. That's when I knew I couldn't stay. But leaving wasn't easy. In our family, leaving meant betrayal. You could fail privately, but you couldn't leave publicly. He used to say, family is forever, especially the expectations. My mother cried the night I told her I was moving out. He'll never forgive you, she whispered. I know, I said, but maybe one day he'll understand. She looked at me sadly. Understanding isn't something he believes in. I left anyway. I rented a small apartment, one window, one bookshelf, and a view of nothing special. For the first time in my life, the silence around me wasn't punishment, it was freedom. I started teaching at a public school downtown. The pay was barely enough for rent. The building was falling apart, and half my students carried more pain in their eyes than I'd ever known existed. But they listened. They asked questions, real ones. One day, a student stayed after class. Why do you do this? You could have done anything. I smiled. So could you. He thought about it, then nodded. That night, I walked home through the rain, drenched but alive. I thought of my father, of his perfect dinners, his cold lessons, his empire built on fear. For the first time, I didn't envy him. I pitied him. He'd spent his whole life teaching people how to obey. I was finally teaching them how to think. I always knew it wouldn't stay secret forever. My father's world was too small, too connected, too hungry for gossip. In a city like ours, shame travels faster than truth. It started with a rumor. One of his colleagues, a man who'd once toasted to the family legacy, sent him an article, a small feature buried in the local paper, former heir of the Ainsworth group now teaching at public high school. It wasn't even critical, it was almost kind. The journalist called me idealistic, which, in his world, was worse than incompetent. He called me that same night. I still remember how calm his voice was, calm the way storms sound before they start tearing roofs off houses. "I read something interesting today," he said. "I figured you would. You're teaching now." "Yes." "At a public school?" "Yes." A pause. Then, softly, "Do you enjoy humiliating me? Or is this just an accident?" "I'm not trying to humiliate you." "Then what would you call it?" "I'd call it living." He laughed, that dry, hollow sound that used to make everyone else at the table go quiet. "Living," he repeated. "You think standing in front of ungrateful children for scraps of money is living? Maybe not for you." His tone sharpened. "Do you even realize what you've thrown away?" "I threw away your expectations, not my life." "You're my son," he said, voice tightening. "Everything you have is because of me." I took a breath. "And everything I didn't have was because of you." The line hung there, long, still, irreversible. He said nothing for almost a minute. I could hear his breathing on the other end of the line, slow and deliberate. Then he said quietly, "You're not my son anymore." He hung up. The silence after that was worse than any scream. For weeks, I went to work pretending it didn't matter. I taught my classes, graded papers, smiled when I could. But late at night, I'd hear his voice in my head. Not the words, just the tone, the certainty, the finality. There's a strange kind of grief that comes from losing someone who's still alive. It doesn't come in waves. It lingers, patient, precise, unforgiving. A month later, I received a letter from my mother. She wrote in the kind of handwriting that always looked like she was apologizing. "He's angry, but he's also scared. Scared that you'll succeed without him. Scared that you'll prove him wrong. I don't know which will hurt him more." I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to. Teaching became my refuge. My classroom was small, chipped paint, flickering lights, desks carved with names of people who'd already given up on themselves. But to me, it was sacred. My students didn't care about my last name. They cared about the way I listened. They cared that I showed up. One of them, a quiet boy named Luis, reminded me of myself at his age, restless, invisible, hungry for recognition. He stayed after class one afternoon, staring at the floor. "Mr. Ainsworth," he said, "my dad says teaching is a waste of time." I smiled. Mine said the same. "What did you do?" "I kept teaching." He looked up at me then, eyes bright. "Did he forgive you?" I hesitated. "Not yet." "Will he?" "I don't know," I said, "but that's not why I teach." He nodded. "I think I get it." He didn't, not fully, but maybe one day he would. That night I stayed late grading essays. The janitor came in, an old man who'd been there longer than most of the teachers. He looked at me and said, "You're the rich one, right?" I smiled faintly. "Used to be." He nodded. "Funny thing about rich folks. They think money's the reward, but the reward's waking up not hating yourself, I think." That was the first time I realized I'd actually made it. Not the kind of made it my father meant, but the real kind. Months passed. The distance between us grew, and the silence hardened into habit. I didn't expect to hear from him, but then, one winter evening, my mother called. "It's your father," she said. "He's in the hospital." My first instinct was denial. "He doesn't get sick." He does now. When I arrived, he was sitting upright in bed, eyes still sharp despite the wires and machines around him. He looked smaller though, as if the weight of his empire had finally started, pressing inward. For a while, neither of us spoke. The air smelled of antiseptic and pride. Then he said, "You look tired." I laughed softly. "You look mortal." He smirked, a ghost of his old self. "So you're still teaching?" "Yes." "Still poor?" "Yes." He studied me as if searching for regret. "Do you at least feel successful?" "I feel necessary," I said. "That's better." He didn't respond right away. His eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the city glowed the way it always had, indifferent and perfect. "You really believe that?" he asked. "Yes." He closed his eyes, leaned back, and whispered something I almost didn't hear. "I hope you're right." That was the closest he ever came to admitting he'd been wrong. He died 2 weeks later. I didn't speak at the funeral. I didn't need to. My sister read the eulogy, full of words like legacy and honor and greatness. I stood in the back, hands folded, listening. When she said, "He taught us everything we know," I almost smiled, because he hadn't. Some lessons I had to teach myself. It's strange the way silence changes over time. When I was younger, It used to suffocate me. The silence of expectation, of judgment, of being looked at without ever being seen. Now, it feels like oxygen, the kind that fills your lungs when you finally step out of someone else's shadow. Years have passed since my father's funeral. The empire is still there. New CEO, new branding, same hollow heartbeat. My sister runs it now, and to her credit, she does it well. She never calls for advice, but she sends a card every Christmas with the same message. Hope you're doing what you love. It's her way of saying I'm sorry without reopening the wound. I still teach. The classrooms have changed. A few more books, a better chair, a ceiling. That doesn't leak when it rains, but the feeling hasn't. The smell of chalk, the sound of pens tapping against desks, the quiet before the bell rings. It's the only kingdom I've ever wanted to rule. Sometimes, I catch myself wondering what he'd think if he could see me now, sleeves rolled up, laughing with students, breaking up arguments about nothing. He'd probably call it a waste of potential. And yet, I think part of him, the part he never allowed to speak, would envy me. He lived in a world that demanded perfection. I live in one that forgives mistake. And in that difference, I finally found peace. One afternoon, after class, a student stayed behind. Her name was Maya, sharp, restless, brilliant in a way that scared her. She said, "My parents want me to study business, but I like art." I smiled. "Then study art. They'll be disappointed. They'll get over it. Or they won't. Either way, you'll still be you." She thought about that for a moment. "Did your parents support you when you became a teacher?" I almost laughed. "No, they went silent." "What did you do?" "I kept talking." She grinned. "That's brave." "No," I said. "That's survival." She left, smiling, and I sat alone for a while, the sunlight stretching across the empty desk. I realized then that my classroom had become a mirror. Every student a version of the boy I once was, trying to make sense of the world's noise. That's what teaching is, not giving answers, just offering space for questions no one else allows. A few years after my father's death, my mother sent me a box. Inside was a collection of his things, cufflinks, pens, notebooks full of half-finished thoughts. At the bottom, there was an envelope with my name on it. It wasn't a letter, just a piece of paper, with one sentence written in his careful, deliberate handwriting. "I was wrong. You were right to choose something real." I read it over and over, waiting to feel vindicated. But what I felt instead was sadness, because I finally understood. He'd spent his whole life chasing permanence, and I'd spent mine trying to escape it. In the end, we were both running from the same thing, fear. His of failure, mine of becoming him. I buried the note under a tree near the school. I didn't need to keep it. Some truths don't need to be framed, they just need to rest. Now, when I walk through the halls, I think about legacy. Not the kind that has a last name printed on building, but the kind that grows quietly in other people's lives. A word remembered, a question asked, a spark that doesn't go out. That's the real inheritance. The kind that doesn't rot or get sold. Sometimes, at night, I dream about that dinner table, the one where the air froze when I said I wanted to teach. In the dream, it's the same room, the same silence. But this time, when my father asks what I want to be, I say, happy, and he doesn't say anything. He just nods. That's when I wake up. People think wealth is measured in what you own. I've learned it's measured in what you can give without needing applause. Every morning, I unlock my classroom and think about how far that silence has traveled. From a golden dining room to this cracked linoleum floor, from crystal glasses to chipped mugs filled with cheap coffee, and I smile. Because here, in this small, imperfect space, I finally learned what my father never could. That meaning isn't inherited, it's made. The other day, one of my students asked me, "Do you ever wish you'd chosen something else?" I told him, "Every time I walk into this room, I know I didn't. Sometimes I still hear that old silence, the one from the dinner table. But now, it doesn't scare me. It listens, it learns, it forgives. I thought I'd lost everything that night. My family's approval, my inheritance, my place at their table. But what I really lost was the need, to be understood by people who never wanted to understand. And that loss, that blessed loss, is what gave me everything. If this story made you think, subscribe. Not for me, but for every child who chose purpose over pride, and every voice that learned to speak even when the room went quiet.